Tonight's session is an overview of the learning profile associated with Down syndrome, and then subsequent sessions are going to focus on a range of different topics, so please do look out for those. My name is Becky Baxter. Officially, I'm a speech and language therapist. That's my kind of background and training. However, for about 15 years now, I have worked supporting schools with pupils who are including pupils with Down syndrome. That's mainstream schools and special schools, both locally and slightly further afield. And I have a team of specialist teachers that I work with in terms of supporting schools across reception, actually right through until end of secondary. So what I'm going to cover this evening, we're going to have a chat about the learning profile associated with Down syndrome. There is a very specific profile, so I'm just going to run through that, and then I'm going to cover learning from listening, learning from looking, because based on this profile, there are some things that are a little bit more challenging for our students, and then things that are a little bit easier, but their strength areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll just touch on associated health issues before we look at social skills and behaviour. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about speech and language. And then just at the end, I'm going to just share with you a bit of information about research and what that means really when we're thinking about what we're offering in our settings. So as I said, there is a very specific learning profile associated with Down syndrome. So in terms of our pupils, let's say we've got a pupil who's age 10, they are going to have an intellectual disability, and that's obviously associated with Down syndrome. And let's say they might have a non-verbal mental age or a cognitive age of around about 6 years. Now, for majority of children, when you measure that non-verbal mental age, there are other skills. So let's think their reading, their writing, their speech and language skills, their motor skills. You would expect them all to be in line with that non-verbal mental age. And for our students, we know that that is not true, that there are some things that are particular strength for the children. They do better than we would predict given that non-verbal mental age. And there are some things that are a particular area of difficulty. And that's what we're going to cover this evening. Of course, just with all children are different, and there's huge variability within children with Down syndrome as well. However, this profile, this associated profile will generally hold true. So for example, one of the things that is most difficult for children with Down syndrome is speech and language skills, and we'll have particular difficulty with speech, and I'm going to talk more about speech later on. And the majority of children with Down syndrome will have difficulties with speech. Now, some children will have clearer speech than others. So we see this variability, but for all children, those areas of difficulty tend to be a particular area of difficulty compared to their non-verbal mental age. Why is it important for us to know this information? What we want to do is to take this information to adapt our teaching method, so you can go tomorrow and think, okay, what am I teaching this morning? I know what's going to be challenging about that for my pupil with Down syndrome, and actually I know what their strengths are. So if I put some of those things in place, that is going to make that activity much more accessible. And that might be in terms of resources, the actual resources that you're going to give them. It might be in terms of how you're delivering your teaching, and it also might be thinking about the environment where they are placed. So learning from listening, I said at the beginning there, we would go through this. This is one of the biggest areas of challenge for students with Down syndrome. We see an incredibly high percent of children struggling with hearing difficulties. Now, that can either be a sensory neurohearing loss, so that might be some damage to the inner ear that's going to be certainly not going to get any better, going to be constant over time. And that is more common in individuals with Down syndrome. But what is particularly more common is what we call a conductive hearing loss. So the children are getting things like glue ear, so getting fluid in your inner ear, and it's getting infected, it hangs around for longer, and that has a huge impact on our child's hearing. So if you're working with a pupil who had their hearing tested back in the summer, that doesn't necessarily reflect how their hearing is going to be for the next 6 months. we see a lot of colds in winter. If you're working with students, you'll know, see a lot of colds, a lot of mucus, and that is likely to impact their hearing. So we know that the children have difficulties hearing any information from the environment around them. We also know that our children have a particular difficulty with verbal short-term memory. So they have difficulties remembering what it is that that you've said, that's been said to them, difficulties holding on to that information. And then they have difficulties processing that information and making sense of it. So if you think about how you learn words, you hear a word, you remember a word, and then you store it up here in your head. And that is what children with Down syndrome find most difficult. So if you think of a word like computer, our children won't hear computer, they might hear computer, they might remember computer, and then they might store and process up here, ooter. So when you say, oh, what's that called? Ah, I know that that's called an ooter. So before I even try and say it, I've got difficulties in terms of having stored these words accurately in my head. Also means we have difficulties understanding spoken language. So when people are giving them information verbally, talking to the children, we have difficulties remembering, holding on, processing that information and following instructions. So if you say, oh, go outside to playtime, but don't play on the grass, they might just hear and remember, play on the grass. And you've just told them the one thing you didn't want them to do. And the other thing just at the bottom there is that calculation and kind of mental maths is often one of the most challenging things for our children because it involves holding on to and manipulating that information. If you think of even just a simple sum, so you might say 6 add 4. They're going to go, oh, I need to get 6 fingers. Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I've got a bit of motor difficulty as well, so got to get that right. And then, oh, how many more was it you wanted me? I can't remember that because I've just worked out getting out my my 6 fingers. So it can be a particular, anything that places a particular demand, but particularly things like maths place huge demand on that system, and we tend to see more difficulties. If we think about our classrooms, now they are much more visual than they used to be. Things like interactive whiteboards are brilliant, but of course, what we tend to do is we give information verbally, and we expect the children to be able to listen to that information, process that information for some meaning, and then leave with that information. And that is the biggest challenge for our pupils, which of course then means that carpet or input time at the beginning of a lesson is one of the most difficult times for our students. So even if they sit there as still as they possibly can, listening as hard as they can, they are unlikely to be able to take in much of that information. Assemblies are another big time. I'm not quite as visual in assemblies as well. There's a lot of verbal input, which is really very challenging for our students. So how can we support this, these difficulties with listening? The first, of course, if we think about the hearing, is making sure that the children are getting regular hearing checks and that we are following advice. And I know one of my most frequent questions when I visit schools or see children, we see children in preschool groups with their parents, is, oh, what's happened with you? Have you got hearing aids? And somebody says, oh, yeah, they're in the bag, or oh, I've left them at home, or they're broken. Of course, they're not going to be doing any good. And we already know we've got difficulties with hearing. So it's really important that our children are wearing those and that somebody is in charge of managing them to make sure that the batteries are working, that the hearing aid itself is working, the batteries don't need changing for the students. The other thing is extra practice. So if you're going to give that bit of information, you want to then make sure that the children are doing something with it and are practicing and using that information. The more they do something with it, the more we'll start to remember that information. Having good eye contact. There's obviously loads of information that you get just from looking at the face. Useful information about the words, but also in terms of facial expression and tone of voice. So it's really important that the children are looking and learning to look to pick up on that visual information. Anytime you can support with non-verbal communication, particularly not spoken communication, is brilliant. So I want to think about how you can be showing the children what to do, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that when we talk about learning from looking. But if you're giving a message like the child, let's say the child has done something that you don't want them to do, or is about to do something you don't want them to do, and what we don't want to do is go, oh, you know, I don't like it when you do that. Are you being a bit cheeky? Because if you can't hear all of that words, that's very positive in terms of the kind of supporting information that you're giving. Oh, she's smiling, she sounds friendly, she's even doing a bit of nodding, saying yes, go ahead and do that, because I can't follow all of that verbal information. So have a think about making sure that kind of everything matches the message that you're trying to give. And then finally, I've put on there about thinking about the environment. Bearing in mind we've got these issues with learning from listening, we want to think about reducing background noise when we can. Now, I know in schools that's not always possible, particularly in reception. It's often quite a noisy class. But if you're thinking, oh, we're going to be doing some work on phonics, going to be doing some work on hearing sounds, listening to sounds, we really need to find a quiet environment to do our small phonics group in. And then the final thing on there says about positioning. It's really helpful to have the child positioned near the front of the class, so they're near the teacher. They've got clear visual to what the teacher is saying in terms of all that non-verbal communication, but also they haven't then got to listen across and drown out all of that other verbal noise and information that may be between them and the teacher if they're near the back. So think about sitting near the front if possible. And really, you want to try and limit teaching from listening, because we know that's the most challenging thing. We want to try and adapt our teaching to provide input in a different way. So what does that look like? Really want to be thinking about learning from looking. Now, again, a high percentage of our pupils will have diagnosed visual difficulties. So it may well be that the child that you're working with is wearing glasses. My second question is normally, oh, where's your glasses? Or can I clean your glasses? Because I think I can't see in, pretty sure you can't see out. So we want to make sure that they are always managed. But in addition to that, individuals with Down syndrome have difficulties with focus. They tend to focus behind the thing that's being presented and have difficulties switching from close to further away. And those pictures on the right there, they come from a program that was run by the Down Syndrome Association. The top row there, the clearer images, are what we would expect our typically developing children in the classroom to be seeing, and then underneath is what our pupils with Down syndrome will be seeing. So you can see that's just looking a little bit more blurred. Again, the children should have their vision checked regularly. They should have some documentation about font size and about best positioning for them to be able to see the resources that are being presented to them, whereabouts is best to present them. I believe the DSA campaign was font size of no smaller than 20. That doesn't mean that the children won't be able to read smaller print than that, but it does mean that it will lead to what we call visual fatigue. So their eyes will become tired, get eye strain, get headaches later on in the day, which they might not be able to tell you about. We want to make sure that we give them then the best visual input. So making sure that their glasses are clean, that they can see out, and that the resources that we're giving them are really, really clear. And I know that we've all done it when we've taken some photos or we've made a worksheet, you've printed it out and something's gone wrong with the printer, the ink's running out maybe, and when you look at them you think, oh, that's not very clear. Our children will not be able to see that. So it's really important that we think, how clear can we make this? Is it really visually accessible? The reason that this is so important is that we know that the children have visual short-term strengths, have a relative strength in learning from looking, much better at remembering what they've seen, much better at remembering what they've done, what they've experienced. So what that means for us really is we want to think about surrounding the child with good models of all the things that we want them to learn, because they're going to be seeing those things, remembering those things, being able to copy those things much more easily than they are from that verbal information. So I want to look for your peers with great speech, great language, who are demonstrating the learning that you want them to be doing, the activity, in terms of behaviour and in terms of play skills, so our children can be supported and scaffolded by their peers. So what would we like, what would I like us to do? What we want to do is as much modelling and demonstration as we can. Now, often what happens is the teacher will give some information, and then the teaching assistant has the role of trying to make that information a bit more accessible. And two things often happen. One is the teaching assistant either then tries to make the information a bit more simplifies the information, make it a bit more accessible for the child at the same time as the teacher is talking. Now, the child's having difficulty with one, they're certainly going to have a lot of difficulty with two. They're not going to be able to process that dual information coming at the same time. Or the second thing that often happens is that the teacher gives the input and the child doesn't get much information from that. And then they go off to the desk and then somebody talks at them again and tries to tell them what to do again verbally. And what would be much more helpful is if the adult supporting the child actually showed them what to do. So they've got their own copy to show them how to do the spelling, show them how to do the writing, circle the key vocabulary. So they're showing the child what it is rather than doing that use of verbal input. And then, of course, use of peers. Oh, have a look what the person next to you is doing. That's what you've got to be doing. Oh, let's show them, they're going to model how to do the first one. Let's say it's a maths question. Right, now we know what we need to do for the next one. So think about how you can use the people around. I mentioned regular checks and then making sure they're following advice, wearing their glasses. Think about font size. How big can you make it? And often kind of in infants, font size is quite large, but as you move through school, tends to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And again, that's going to cause some visual difficulties for our pupils. The other thing to think about is thinking about ruled lines on the page. So those thin blue lines, really hard for the students to see where they're supposed to position their writing. Also, the student might have difficulty seeing a line if it's really faint. So if they're having difficulty pressing hard with pencil, that can mean that you end up with a really faint line, which our students then won't be able to see where they're writing, won't be able to read that back, or it will be leading to some of that visual fatigue that I mentioned, straining to be able to see those things. You really want to make it big, make it bold, which was the DSA campaign. Think about any visuals that you can use. So if you're doing shapes, you've got the objects there. This is the square. I don't have to follow what you're saying. Remember what a square is, call it up to mind. I've got it in front of me to be able to see those. If I'm talking about Bunsen burners and beakers, I've got them there. I've got a picture of them there for me to see and remember what they are. So loads of pictures, loads of objects themselves. Having written text. Mentioned about the difficulties with maths, often word reading, so seeing a word and recognising it is a relative strength for pupils with Down syndrome. And if you've got a child who's great at reading, you want to make the most of that strength as you can. Think about labelling new vocabulary, labelling positions on a clock. O'clock goes at the top, half past goes at the bottom. This is the minute hand, right minute hand on the minute hand. Because if they're seeing it, that is going to help them remember it. Thinking about the environment again, I'm not sure that there are many uncluttered environments in school, but think about where you can, clearing off stuff that you don't need anymore. Often when we go into school, we see that the students have quite a lot on their desk, often more than anybody else has on their desk. So you want to think about how we can reduce that as much as we can. If you've got worksheets, thinking about having the key information, blowing up the questions so that maybe you've got 6 questions instead of 12 questions on a page. So there's much less for them to have to look through and to draw their gaze away. And then thinking about when you're going to review what you did the last lesson, rather than saying, oh, do you remember in the last lesson that you've lost me already? I want to look back and see what I did before, what we're going to be building on. So I would be urging you to think as much as you can about how you can record what the child's done and show it back to them. So it might be you go, oh, this is your maths book. Let's have a look at the addition page. Oh, here we've got add. Do you remember that symbol? Here's an example of the work that you did last lesson. This is all adding. Do you remember we're using a number line? There it is. So I can see it in front of me and remember before I get on to doing it. And the other thing which is fantastic is video. Oh, look, let me watch myself doing some of those addition sums I did in the last lesson. Oh, yeah, I can see. Nobody needs to talk to me. I can see exactly what I did. Visual reminder to myself, and I'm ready to get on with the task now. But anyway, you can record visually and use that visual to review would be brilliant. So I would mention there are a number of associated health issues come along with Down syndrome. So you can see them on there. I'm not going to spend time going through them all, just to say that we see increased issues with heart, bowel, digestive, thyroid, sleep difficulties, and we tend to pick up infections, and they tend to hang around for longer and can become quite a nasty, some nasty bugs. The reason I say that is just for you to think, oh, well, I know what it's like when I'm not feeling great. And I haven't slept well, or I'd rather be on the sofa with a duvet, I've got a stinking cold. Our students might be feeling like that quite a bit. So it's just to kind of keep that in mind. The brown shape there with the question mark is just to say, and anything else. Many of our students will have additional needs such as autism or cerebral palsy. Just because you have Down syndrome, it does not stop you getting having any of these other things as well. Social skills and behaviour. This is a relative strength for our individuals with Down syndrome. We tend to have better than non-verbal mental age would predict. Talked about where our cognitive level is. We tend to have better social skills. So what I would be saying is we want to be expecting age-appropriate behaviour. If you're working in reception, what are the other children in reception doing? If you're working in year 6, what are the other students in year 6 doing? If you're working in secondary, have a look at what is the appropriate behaviour in that year group, and then making sure we're supporting our pupils to be able to develop their skills and continue to develop their skills in terms of that social interaction and behaviour. Of course, learning is social. We learn from others all of the time. So I've put on there about the importance of mainstream settings. You're going to school, or you're going to clubs or groups where you're interacting with a range of people of different abilities. And the other thing, having said social skills are a strength, what I would say, having asked about hearing aids and glasses, my other big recommendation for schools is about developing independence. And if you have a pupil who has quite a high level of adult support, it can be easy to step in and support the child and do things for them when really want to be thinking about what could they be doing for themselves. So have a look around, what's everybody else doing? Everybody else is lining up, you need to be lining up as well, supporting the pupils to look out for what all of those visual cues, because they probably miss the instruction verbally, and picking up on that rather than relying on somebody who's going to come along and sort them out, get them where they need to be, give them that extra support. Most of our adults will have good independence and daily living skills if expectations are high and skills are developed. So I'll always be looking for having an independent skill. I'll be looking for the students to be working independently throughout part, at least, of all lessons. Okay, so speech and language, I said I would go through speech and language, and that earlier on that speech and language was one of the biggest difficulties for our pupils. Within speech and language, there are a number of different areas or domains, and they're not an even profile within themselves. There are some areas of speech and language which are more of a challenge than others. So if we start on the left there, we see vocabulary. So vocabulary is just the single words that you understand and that you know, or that you're able to produce. So your receptive vocabulary, your understanding, and your expressive vocabulary, the number of words or signs that you're able to convey to somebody else. Now, in the early years, that is going more slowly, but it continues to develop. And when we assess speech and language in our school-age children, vocabulary will often come out as a relative strength, with receptive vocabulary, the words that the child understands, often much higher than expressive vocabulary, than the number of words that the child is able to produce. And that gives us a bit of a challenge, because we often will base our assumptions of what others understand based on what they're able to produce. So it's really important that we know the difference between these two, and the difference is often quite significant. What it means is that the pupils will need more repetitions to learn new vocabulary. So if you think, oh, I'm going to be teaching about Egypt, or I'm going to be teaching about solids, liquids and gases, think about your key vocabulary and think about making sure that the students get lots of repetition of that vocabulary so they know what it is. Give them some visuals, write it down, have the text there as well, for them to learn that vocabulary. At the bottom there, it says that we have poor phonological representations. Now that's a posh term for the way you have that word stored in your head. Like I said at the beginning, we have difficulties storing these words like computer accurately. So often we'll know, oh, computer, yeah, I know that one, that's that one over there. But in terms of how refined that pattern of sounds is for that word, that's often a challenge. And then, of course, if you think about words that sound similar, we may well hear or have stored all those words the same. So if you think of words like cat, hat, mat, sat, fat, we may just have heard and stored them as at. Repetitions, the better those phonological representations will be. Next one along there is syntax. So that's really language above single words. So vocabulary, single words. Now we're thinking about understanding sentences or instructions, or being able to put sentences together. We know that the children have more difficulty with expressive language, just like I mentioned with the vocabulary, often understanding language, but we're not able to produce. And we have a particular difficulty with morphosyntax and grammar. So that's really those function words, things like is and the and to and for, are all very challenging for our students. And then word endings, so things like the difference between jump and jumps and jumping and jumped. If you think about it, they're really, really hard to hear the difference between. Hearing difficulties, verbal short-term memory difficulties, is not a surprise that we have difficulties with that grammar. So it is more of a challenge. In terms of speech, we're thinking about difficulties with clarity and intelligibility, how clearly the child can say words and how intelligible they are then to others. And that's often a significant area of difficulty for our students. And then conversation. We have this strength in early and non-verbal communication. So our young children tend to have great facial expression, tone of voice, great at conveying what they want and what they don't want without necessarily having to say many words. Often our children will be introduced to sign early on. They have strengths in use of sign. We have difficulties with later conversation skills, which often then come back to difficulties with language. So things like being able to start a conversation. What did you do at the weekend? Are you going to football club tonight? They're obviously examples that involve language, and they are much more tricky. Being able to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said, or oh, you haven't understood what I meant. Again, much more tricky. Okay, so what can we do? Want to think about the speech and language demands of the task. So when you think about, I'm going to be teaching about Egyptians, what does the child already know about Egyptians? Maybe nothing. We need to start to think about bringing in some of that information. If you're thinking about a number task, do they know their numbers? So have a think about what's involved in the task. It might be the vocabulary that is that the task is focused on, or it might be more general information like that. Do they know what a ruler and a maths book and a number line is? So they're not going to be able to go and get those things when you ask them to. So when you're thinking about differentiating your lesson, think about your vocabulary demands. It'd be great to go, oh, I know, I'm not stuck on Egypt now. I know we're going to be doing about Egypt. Here are 6 words to do with this topic, and I'm going to see, does the child know them at the beginning? Do they know them at the end of the task? I'm going to focus my differentiation around some of this key vocabulary. Include language targets within written work. So if you're working on use of and or because, but, or doing Egypt, let's do past tense about the Egyptians, doing pronouns, having a think about, oh, I know that they're something that we're working on. I'm going to have those on the desk written out. Going to see if we can include those in our work. Going to highlight those in text. Going to go back over them. Going to talk about them. I'm going to bring that in to our differentiation. Child's got difficulty with a particular sound, or the target is a particular sound. Think about underlining that sound in text. So if they've written some sentences, get the child to go through, depending on their age and ability, and underline all of the t sounds, and then having a go at making all of those t sounds. In little reading books, get your pencil, underline some of those sounds so that when the child sees that, they're reminded to have a go at practicing it accurately rather than practicing wrong and then somebody saying, oh, don't forget, that's one of our target sounds. So you can see that visual prompt there for them. And then think about targeting conversation skills. How do you start a conversation? How are our students going to interact with other students? Because they're desperate to, got that social strength, that social understanding, and want to be engaging with you, but I might not have the language to do it. There's just some examples there. I've actually put some examples on the next slide. So you can see there, it might just be having a topic map on the desk. I've got some visuals. I can then point to those things. I can show my friend that thing, those things. I can get my friend to talk about that. Oh, look, it's the moon. Oh, yeah, it's the moon. That's there on the desk now for me to start a conversation. There's a few examples of different types of, might be a conversation diary. So you can see I am playing football. That would be, you'd have a picture in there of something that you've done and a sentence underneath, and you'd bring that into school to show your friends. The idea is you might practice it with an adult first. Oh, let's have a look. What did you do at the weekend? Oh, you're playing football. Brilliant. Who are you going to go and share that with? And that ideally that book is kept somewhere that the child can have access to at the appropriate times to support them sharing the things that they do regularly. And often as students like to look back through those. But show my friends, oh, football, do you play football? Yeah, who do you play football with? My dad. There's a kind of slightly more advanced one at the bottom there for older people who had a new dog. So you can say, what can I say? I've got some exciting news, lovely news, interesting news. You can see you can pop some examples in there, some questions that that child could then ask another child. Some of my secondary students just keep a diary, but in there they might put, oh, on Saturday, or I don't know what day it's on, I watched Dancing on Ice. Who went out? Who's your favourite? So just when I sit down for my lunch, I know to get out my diary, and there's a few prompts in there to remind me what to have a conversation about, what to ask. There's some conversation cards there. They're just very simply pictures of on a topic. Generally, we'd be looking for a topic that other students in the class are interested in. So if it's the latest Marvel film, or it might be the latest Disney film, again, depending on the age, the child might just have those to hand, might keep them in their pocket, might have them on a little key ring, they might take them out at break time, might have them when they're waiting on the carpet, just to show to my friend what everybody else is chatting about things that I know you're interested in and want to talk about. That one there's favourite football team, so don't even have to necessarily have watched the football. This person definitely had, but I've checked on my I've checked on my team, I've chosen a team, I've checked on them, I can go in and talk to the other friends who are interested in football. I know how my team got on. How did your team get on? Who is your favourite team? Did they win? So I would finish just about saying a little bit about the research on education and students with Down syndrome. The first paper there in 2021 did a survey of students in the UK. So we did a survey of parents and educators. The first one there is about parent information on what education is like for pupils with Down syndrome at the moment in the UK. So we found that the majority of pupils were in mainstream primary school in the UK, and that number reduces when we get into secondary. Pupils who are in special school were rated as having significantly greater needs. So majority of pupils with Down syndrome go to mainstream school, and those who tend to go to special school tend to have greater needs, have some of those additional needs I was talking about earlier on. And our pupils in mainstream school are reported to receive a high level of teaching assistant report. Over half had over 30 hours, and then the majority had over 25 hours of support. Second one there is then about educators. So we asked SENCOs, teachers, teaching assistants about who were currently supporting a pupil with Down syndrome in their school, about the sorts of support, and found that there was generally a lack of clarity around the roles and responsibilities of the teacher and the teaching assistant, who's doing the planning, who's doing the delivery, who's doing preparation of resources, which is in line with other research for other populations of TAs supporting pupils with additional needs in school. TA is often taking on the role of teaching, and that can happen that our pupils become a bit separate. And we always want to be thinking that it's the teacher who's responsible for teaching all the children in the class, and ours. It's equally important they know where that child is as they do for everybody else. And they all highlighted the need for more targeted professional training for educators. So it's great that groups like Twinkl are putting on these sorts of sessions for educators. The final one there, it's quite an old study now, but it can't be replicated in the UK because this was when inclusion was just getting started. And what they were able to do is to look at two groups of students, one in mainstream school and one in special school, who then went through in those different education placements. Why we can't redo it now is because at the time, because inclusion was just getting going, we had two groups who were even in terms of their cognitive development, their speech and language needs, whereas now our group in mainstream school tend to, there's an uneven group. So we have this group in specialist provision with greater needs. What they found though, which is important to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about it, is that the pupils in mainstream school show gains of more than 2 years in spoken language and 3 years in literacy, that they had significant gains in maths, general knowledge and social independence, and that we saw less significant behaviour difficulties in mainstream school. Now, like I said, we can't replicate this in this country, still continue to be researched in other areas. So some research in the Netherlands found that children in mainstream schools perform significantly higher in reading, maths and writing. Children in special schools spent 1.5 to 2 times less time on academics throughout the day. And children with lower cognitive scores in mainstream schools outperform children with higher cognitive scores in specialist schools in terms of reading. So the children who maybe had lower non-verbal mental age, lower cognitive age, did better in reading in mainstream schools than those who had maybe higher abilities at the beginning in terms of their cognitive abilities in specialist schools. Some research to say that pupils are more likely to be included in PE, music, lunch break times than for academic subjects. I think particularly that can be true if you've got a split placement where you are being included in some parts of the lesson with your mainstream peers, but not in all parts of the day. And again, there's some evidence to say that more time is spent on other things in specialist school, like physical care, therapies, waiting for other students. So what does that mean for us? Really, it means that wherever you are, we want to have a focus on literacy and numeracy throughout the day. So thinking about, as much as we can, getting that repetition of those really core skills, be it in literacy and numeracy lessons, or you're also probably doing literacy when you're talking about writing up your science experiment, when you're doing your history work, and similarly for numeracy, it might come up again in science, or it might come up again when we're doing dates. So think about getting that high level of repetition, and that might involve getting making sure you get an extra practice in terms of some homework. We'd also be thinking about looking for able peers to support those social skills, and I touched on this earlier on. If we think about the differences in terms of those two settings, we really want our students who are struggling with speech and language to be surrounded by other talkers who can start conversations, who can ask questions, who can wait and expect and listen to those questions, but also who are modelling that all the time for them. So think about the peers that you're with. So in specialist school, it might be that your classes are separated in terms of ability a little bit. Think about having our people with Down syndrome in with those great models of speech, language, learning, behaviour. And similarly in mainstream school, think about where the pupil is sitting. Often they might be sitting with the less able group, and actually we might be going, oh, we want them over there with a really great, we're differentiating anyway, so we'd rather be over there with the great models of whatever it is they're supposed to be getting on and doing. It's really important that we ensure we have friends with a range of needs. We know we're not the only one who has Down syndrome, and that we have friends in terms of mainstream peers, but also in terms of peers with additional needs. And most importantly, we want to be looking for positive models of behaviour. I said at the beginning, this is a first of a monthly sessions that we're going to be running, and the next session is actually looking at that behaviour in a bit more detail. I thought I'd also just share with you those guidelines that are out there for you to have a look at. So there's the Down Syndrome Good Practice Guidelines for Education, and the International Guidelines for Education for People with Down Syndrome. And they include some nice checklists and some guidance to have a look at, kind of auditing a little bit informally, and the practice that you have going on in your setting. Okay, so just to summarise, all skills are learned through everyday interactions and experiences. If you're a good teacher, teaching assistant, parent, you're all going to be great at teaching all children. This is just thinking about taking into account the learning profile. What is it I know is going to be challenging? I can do something about that. What's going to be supportive? I can put those supports in place so that we can help our students to access some of those opportunities and to be more independent in terms of their learning, behaviour, friendships, through everything really throughout the day. Consider the environment, look around for those good models, as I mentioned, and just wanted to say that lots of the activities and strategies that we've talked about will support many children and pupils, particularly those pupils who are struggling, who probably have difficulties with speech, language and verbal short-term memory difficulties.